One of the main reasons that the way that we put together these panels is to have a diversity of voices, of opinions, of expertise, of worldviews, of lifespans, as a way of getting at truths from many angles to try to paint a broader picture. So as we think deeply today, for the rest of the time we have together, about the environment and about our God-given role within it, I think we'll quickly realize that this is a multidisciplinary conversation just by its nature. Just biology, meteorology, sociology, they all inform our public policy. While our theology, our creation care, our biblical studies, our eco-womanism, as we'll talk about later, all inform our spiritual responses to this crisis. This is by definition a global conversation, so we have sought to assemble today a panel that can speak to some of the ways that people of faith are approaching it. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Dr. Rebecca Hayes is the Assistant Dean of STEM at Montgomery County Community College and one of the science advisors to the project. If you'd like to make your way up to your seat. She was very instrumental in the grant writing process as well, and helping us to work towards this place where we are today. I'd also like to welcome Amani Reid, the Policy Engagement Manager at Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, which is a community of congregations, faith-based organizations, and individuals of faith responding to climate change as an ethical and moral issue through advocacy, education, and energy conservation, energy efficiency, stewardship, and the use and promotion of clean, renewable energy. So, finally, Dr. Donald Brash, Associate Professor of Historical Theology at Palmer Theological Seminary and one of the project leaders for Palmer Seminary's Science for Seminaries team. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here, for being willing to share your diverse expertise and opinions and wisdom with us today. As we did with the last panel discussion, I'm just going to start us off with one question. And we'll go down the line and you can each give your answer. And then after that one question, we'll open it up to the floor. If you have a question here in this space, please make your way over to the microphone so that everyone can hear you and the folks at home can hear you. If you're on Zoom right now, please either write it in the chat or in the Q&A function. I will be able to see both of them. I'll have my laptop and I will be I'll be up here. I'll stand up here with the laptop and be able to direct some of that. So, Dr. Hayes, we'll begin with you. Broadly speaking, what is God's connection to nature? And by extension, what is our responsibility to it?
I think the first is the simplest answer. God is the creator. He is the creator of everything in our universe, be it living or non-living. I spent the last 10 years before the position I have now as a biology professor here at Eastern University. I often spoke about God as the author of life, but also the artist of life. Because when I look at creation, I see a God who is incredibly creative with everything he made. And that creative spark of what life is, what he dreamed it to be, is something that is seen throughout all of nature. And God's connection to nature also involves what it does for him. Nature exists to please God, to entertain him, because I am convinced that God is entertained by bird song, by falling leaves, by the beauty of flowers in the spring, and by the things that we do as well. Nature exists to serve God in many ways, but also to worship him and to honor him. God loves nature, but he didn't just create it. As Dr. Bradstreet mentioned yesterday, God also sustains his creation, that his power is an important part of every bit of it. He is pleased by it, And I believe that God mourns when things happen to his creation that are not what he would have intended. What is our responsibility? It's pretty simple. You can go back to Genesis. We're supposed to work and care for the garden. But that's where things get a little bit messy. Because what does that actually mean? It wasn't just about the Garden of Eden, right? It's about all of creation. So we're supposed to care for it and work it. But that really means, if you look back at the root words here, that we're to serve it, that it is to take care of us as much as we care for it. If we nurture nature, it in turn will nurture us. We are to manage it, to guard it, to protect it, and then to restore the parts that we have broken. We're also to learn about nature. As a scientist, I believe that part of my responsibility is to understand the created world better. And I believe that doing so allows me to not only get to know it better, but to get to know God, our creator, better. And we honor God through treating his creation with respect. And our intended connection to nature is one that is supposed to be rooted in love of God, love of his creation, and also one that allows us to understand more, because we have scripture as a wonderful way to get to know God. But we often talk about artwork, and the ways you understand the work of an artist and who they are is by examining what they've made and what they've done. So can't we get to know God in the same way? So part of our responsibility then to nature is to learn more about the one who created it.
Hello, I would like to share a verse. It's from Romans 1:10. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. I believe that a primary way God nourishes our souls with his loving presence is through the beauty of nature, his creation. And I believe his creation is all around us. It's things that we don't always acknowledge in our everyday lives. The sun, the moon, the stars, just a reminder of his light and love. And throughout the Bible, we read testimony of the Lord communicating to us in the skies and the oceans and the environment, a lot of what was mentioned. And I believe it's our responsibility to be stewards of the earth and of nature, protecting nature for all living beings, including humans. And I, as a child and as a teenager, I got to travel, and I've been able to travel internationally. And for me, traveling outside of the US and being in other parts of the world like Ghana, I saw the love and passion that a lot of people have for nature and how they use their environment for the better of the community, for the better of their, for the planet. And I believe that is, as human beings, our responsibility as well. And as a young person in this field, I'm just trying to advocate and make people aware of that as well. But I believe that's our responsibility. Thank you.
We theologians have an ongoing conversation about God's relationship to creation. On the one hand, we have those who take what we might call a more transcendent view of how God is positioned relative to nature. Karl Barth is an example of this. God is wholly other, and yet God is still involved. But for Barth, it's very important, not to confuse God with anything worldly. And so he rejected, and this is a famous line among theologians, he rejected any analogia entis, that is, any analogy of being between anything in nature, including us, and God. But there are other theologians who take a different tack. And they are on the other pole, I'll say, process theologians, for whom God is intimately involved with nature. Indeed, they embrace something short of pantheism, which they call panentheism. All things exist in God. Well, if all things exist in God, then obviously the connection is secure between God and nature. And yet they also say that God is not to be identified with nature. So these two poles have many points of view between them, of course. Theologians, being theologians, we nuance things in a way that reflects our ongoing discussions of infinity. And on the one hand, if we say, I would propose that it is more likely that someone who has a transcendent view of God's involvement with creation is less inclined to be involved with creation care. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Right? That's why I said very carefully, less inclined. And those who see God in nature, even though distinguishing God from nature, are going to be more inclined toward creation care. And here I'll refer to the image of God idea, which I think gets begged forward by what I've said. There's a parallel in the between the transcendent immanent discussions in the way we understand the image of God and who bears it. There are those theologians who would say that only humanity bears the image of God. And there are those theologians who would say all of creation bears the image of God. You might guess that those who are more immanentist are the latter, and those who are more transcendent in their view of God's relationship with nature are the former. So again, how we see God in nature, I submit, will have an impact on how we care for nature. And while I don't want to make that a blanket generalization, I think it's a good general statement to start from in discerning among theological points of view in response to the question, how does God relate to nature?
Thank you for your always carefully chosen words. I've always appreciated that about you. So anyone who would like to open us up, break the ice with a question can head over to the microphone or type it into the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we can get started with the Q&A.
Thanks to you all. I want to start off with just a really easy question about natural evil. And, the ways in which you think, so in my field, we talk a lot about Francis Bacon and the ways in which a certain kind of theological interpretation of nature being quite broken and evil being quite present might lead us into, push us into scientific discovery to fix nature. Whereas others might think about our role as sustaining what is already the goodness of creation. And I think one leads us to a very progressive science that almost has no sort of endpoint, whereas one might halt us in other kinds of ways. I wonder how you think about how evil has been present in the natural world, maybe as a result of sin, if that's part of your theology, and the ways in which science then interacts with the correcting or fixing of nature, if such evil exists.
Is that for one of us or all of us?
That's up to you all.
Since that sounded like a theological question, so I'll start if the others don't mind.
Go ahead.
It's funny how when you mention the word evil, there's a struggle as to who's not going to respond. I differentiate between the problem of suffering and the problem of evil. I'm not saying that they are unrelated, but I'm saying that suffering achieves an acuteness in the presence of moral agency. An example of this might be a child disciplined by their parent. When that discipline is well motivated and not proceeding from the parent's pathology, is experiencing something different than a child who is disciplined by a parent proceeding from a healthy psychological and spiritual position. That helps me in looking at the history of the world. It seems to me that suffering was in the world long before humanity came on the scene. I mean, to what extent was that suffering perceived as such by self-conscious persons, or I'm sorry, self-conscious entities, I should say, is of course an ongoing question. There are, after all, predecessors of Homo sapiens. And even prior to our predecessors, there are predecessors in the natural world who experienced death, being torn apart by another species or what have you. So when then does suffering become an agent or something used by evil? When does it reach the acute phase? It seems to me that happens through the hands of self-reflective, imaginative agents who are responsible for what we do. And that is where I see humans as the author of evil in the world.
I have a hard time also with putting evil and suffering as always part of the same thing, and even pain for that matter. It's something my students long struggled with because they would say, well, you talk about a world that has life in it, that has evolved, which means that in order for things to have evolved, things have died. And if things died, there is pain and evil and suffering. But is that the result of evil? I tend to not think so, not perhaps in that way. But you will also find perhaps many people in this room that will argue that mosquitoes are evil. And well, that's really a matter of opinion, I suppose. I'm sure frogs would argue that no, they taste lovely, thank you. Please keep letting them bite you. But I think part of what you mentioned that I definitely want to respond to, because of my background in research, is I've worked on invasive species. One in particular, Phragmites australis, which if anyone wants to see it later, I'll take you on a little tour of campus. We have some here. An invasive species are plants, animals, or fungi, anything really that is growing in an area where it is not native, where it is not normally found. Many of them have been spread throughout the world by our activities, whether that is intentional or accidental, depends on the one you're looking at. My background is in oceanography. Many of the invasive species that have been spread throughout the oceans of the world were spread through the transport of ballast water. It was not intentional. Ships take water up in one port, they dump that water in another port, and thus they move hundreds, if not thousands of species when they do this. But with many invasive species, they get established and they start then outpacing the native species, which is where that invasive part comes in. They start changing the ecosystem they've become a part of. They don't serve the same purpose that the other plants, animals, or other things they've displaced served. And when we do restoration work to remove them, to fix the ecosystem, because it's an ecosystem that we messed up, intentionally or not, I think that is good work. I think it does relate to disciplining a child. If they've hurt someone, you take them and they apologize and they try to make things better. If they stole something, you would give the money to the store so that things were equal. And by trying to fix an ecosystem, we're very much trying to do that. But the question becomes, what do I fix it to be? We're now realizing that there was this longstanding idea that we should fix it to what it was in North America as pre-European, whatever word you'd like to use for it, discovery, settlement, invasion, your choice. And we can't do that. We shouldn't be using that as our baseline for today. Those ecosystems aren't what they were then. And restoring them to that may actually be taking them to a place we think they should be, but not where they would be naturally. So you need to look at the ecosystems that you're working with to determine if fixing them is even appropriate. And this is where science and policy need to talk together. And it's also where theologically we have to become a little bit comfortable with the idea that sometimes we are causing damage to the things God made that we can't fix. And there's some sin involved, perhaps, but also a lot of shame and a sense of responsibility that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah, I just want to add, not necessarily from a theological perspective, but I feel like looking at bigger companies and like, for example, like fossil fuel industries, where those are entities that are making drastic effects to our ecosystem and environment that it's not in the same sense of ways that we could kind of, how do I say this? Ways that we can impact the environment, like the way that we personally impact it might be, is not as impactful. So I feel like looking at these higher entities and like politicians and seeing, like you said, studying the environment and working together is very important to somewhat tackle the evils that we're facing. And yeah, more than anything, I think educating and working together is important.
There's a follow-up question on Zoom for you, Amani Reid. But as you mentioned in passing earlier that your international travels influenced your ideology of God and of the environment, and would like to know in what ways, and for those of us who have not spent much time outside of our own context.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, like traveling out of the country is what really inspired me to get into this work. And I specifically mentioning Ghana because that was a very life-changing trip for me. And I had to live in a different way than I usually live. And I feel like everything about the environment I was in was very different. And I had to, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about ways I can better take care of my environment around me. I was 15 at the time. So I was trying to learn things I could do as a teenager, you know, in order to make a change and advocate and kind of, I care, you know, I realized I care about the state of the environment, and I wanted to make a change and make an impact and make people aware. So I always like to mention my international travels because I really feel like in ways countries are doing things differently, and like, oftentimes the US is doing things differently than other countries, and it might not be the best way for us to sustain and treat our environment. So I feel like traveling and even traveling outside of, or traveling within the US and seeing other environments and being in nature, I feel like all of that is a part of creating an understanding and better serving and being better stewards. So.
Thank you.
Hi. Hypothetically thinking, I have a question here. God said, go and multiply. Now here we are. We multiply and we need clothes. We multiply and we need houses. We need food. The way that this world is becoming so small because we are so many. So do you think God's commandment there at the garden was wrong, or do you think, what's the plan? Does God gonna create another planet maybe to so as we can go there? Or what do you do? Do we have to fix everything that is made because of, you know, you have to fix everything. What do you think is the plan? Just
Well, I'm sorry, I actually didn't fully hear the first part of your question, but as what I've been doing with Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light is trying to, well, specifically in Pennsylvania, trying to educate faith communities and people who are just advocates for the environment, educating on policies and actions that are going on around the state, things that we can do, which I feel like, me personally, just the years I've been in this, field and learning and growing, I've learned so much from other people, and sharing that knowledge with young people, people I know, is a big impact, I feel like. And I go back to environmental policies because there's a lot going on in the state, and even, in our country with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and within our own state, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. These are initiatives and things that myself and like other advocates are really trying to push into the community, push to our politicians and local legislators, because for things like that, they are empowered and they can, make those decisions, in Harrisburg and higher up. So personally, I feel like stewardship, making sure our environment is clean, educating other people around us is something that we can do every single day. And I try to do, even just contacting, knowing who your legislators are, making your voice heard, letting them know that you care about these things and you care about the state of our planet. I feel like that is something that makes an impact, especially the more and more people that do it, if that makes sense. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I want to piggyback on that for a moment, because I think that's really important. He was asking about also with so many people, and this is how we can have a planet that can care for that many people. Without having a planet that is healthy, it cannot care for us appropriately. And keeping it healthy is thus part of our work. The world population is really big. I'm not sure God ever intended for it to be this big. I'm not certain. There also is an interplay with medicine and technology that we have to keep in mind too, because humans are living a lot longer than they used to. And the last panel mentioned quite a bit about end-of-life care and prolonging life, and we're able to do a lot of that because of the medical advances that we have, but also the technological advances. Because when it's negative degrees outside, we're all nice and warm inside of our homes with our heating and our blankets, and everything's great. So the things that would have potentially kept the human population in check, population-wise, from expanding too large, we've also conquered them. We don't really have many natural predators at this point. Sure, you'll hear of people getting killed by sharks, hippos, large animals, I suppose, bears, I don't know. But it doesn't happen often, correct? Because we have ways of keeping that from happening.
I think I heard in the question something about the text of the Genesis creation accounts, and I'll speak to that. It seems to me that all texts must be interpreted in contexts, and if we make the assumption that that those texts were written for particular times and places, they were collected for particular times and places, as well as having wisdom and meaning for us, then we can say things like, or offer interpretations such as, at the very beginning, it would make sense to say, be fruitful and multiply. But it might not be what would be said to us today. again, accounting for differences of time and place. That then would not constitute a mistake. Not that that would necessarily be troubling in and of itself, but it would rather constitute something that we often see in the biblical texts, and that is a conditionedness by time and place.
That was an awkward walk. Hi, everyone. My name is James. I am a local pastor, and I'd like to present a question to you that is posed to me very often, often with presuppositions attached to it. So why should we as Christians, looking towards a distant, perhaps far distant, eschatological reality wherein the reign of God is actualized completely, why should we care about this planet, which is, as we heard yesterday, destined for death at some point anyway?
Let's try.
I just, the first thing that came to my mind is future generations that are going to be here while this planet is still intact. So I think it's important for us to not necessarily leave this planet in a state of like what it could be if we weren't doing the work that we're doing. So I think it's very important looking at just young people and even myself, like, because I work at Pennsylvania Infant Parent Life, I work with a lot of people who have been doing this work for decades. So I feel like if just looking at that relationship, like a lot of what I'm being taught is kind of like, we want you to continue this work so that you can continue this work for whoever is here after me. And at the end of the day, there will be someone after me. And I think it's important, as the first question stated, we're stewards of the earth. So I think it's important, no matter what, to take care of our planet. Things like trash, litter, pollution, things like that, especially living in Philadelphia. I feel like, yeah, that's something we can't just kind of ignore. And the reality is, if we don't tackle it and really educate and advocate, then it's just going to get worse and worse before those generations even come. So I feel like that's imperative, especially with the devastations we've been facing in this part of our country. I feel it's very important. We have no choice. I feel like we have no choice but to do this work for ourselves. I mean, we're still here alive, and there's, we don't know what God has in store. So I feel like we should, kind of continue to be stewards, and looking at future generations. I would like people to somewhat, look up to me as far as how I look at, the environment, and even just, I bring up trash and litter a lot because that's something that bothers me very much. And the people I'm around know that bothers me, and they don't litter around me. So I feel like I've made a small impact there. It's not gonna have a huge difference in the city, but one small step I feel like is what we have to do to make it bigger. So
I think I'd probably push back and ask them, are they sure the planet's actually headed for destruction? And probably follow it up with do you believe you need to follow any of the 10 commandments or like tell others about Jesus? Because I'm pretty sure the Bible's equally clear that we're supposed to take care of the earth we've been given. But beyond that, I sometimes think there's a political connection to some of this, particularly if they start talking about climate change, which is something I've studied for more than 20 years of my life. And it becomes maybe it's really not changing. Well, okay, we could also look at the data together, but regardless of that, do I want to live in a planet that is plagued by actions of sin? Or do I want to start doing some of the redeeming work of Christ, which is, to me, more than just ensuring others get to heaven. It's also redemption work that's done here in caring for the lives of other humans, but also in caring for our planet, because all of creation is suffering, not just us. And if I choose to not care for the planet, then I'm continuing to allow additional suffering that I could potentially work to lessen. And I think as a Christian, I am called to do the work of redemption where God has placed me.
I could address this question as a grandfather and say, I want the planet to be healthy for my grandchildren and their children. As a theologian, the word eschatology was mentioned. There's more than one way to conceptualize the reign of God in the world, and not all of those are fully embedded in the future. There is realized eschatology, which locates the emerging reign of God in the here and now. And there is inaugural eschatology, which is the now and not yet way of thinking about the reign of God. It's now, but it's not fully here. And we have a responsibility as people who are followers of Jesus in particular to be instrumental in the advancement of that reign. And there's actually a fourth option, which is proleptic eschatology, and it's very close to inaugural eschatology. And basically, what the idea of prolepsis is it's something making real in the present, something that's in the future. And with that idea of eschatology, the reign of God is something that is here and now, and we participate in the emerging of it. So those latter two, in fact, the latter three options have us working with God, along with God, to be life-giving. I think it may be helpful at this point to just say my operative definition of sin, evil, is that which is life-diminishing, attitudes and behaviors that are life-diminishing. If we are cooperating with God and the advancement, the emergence, I prefer, of God's reign, then we're going to be instrumental in life-giving behaviors and policies, not only for humans, as perhaps God's unique image bearers, but for the whole of creation, which also bears God's image.
We have a very specific question from Dr. Johnson, the seminary's interim dean. And this is for Amani. Specifically, would you describe some of your legislative advocacy work? What are their particulars, and maybe what can we be researching and looking up? How might we educate ourselves a bit more about how we can help on the larger scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, firstly, knowing who your legislators are and knowing how to reach out to them is important. In order to let them hear your voice and hear let them hear what you want them to know about climate change and why it's important to you. And with Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, as the policy engagement manager, I host policy update calls for the state every month. And that's information that's federal and statewide. A lot of the work I've been doing this year is on things going on in the White House, making sure that President Biden is aware of the very dire issue, which is climate change, and making that very, very prevalent in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which still has not been passed, and as well as having that aspect of climate justice included in the Build Back Better agenda. That's a lot of the work I've been doing as far as working with faith communities and members of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light in letting our politicians and legislators know the importance of this. I've also set up constituent meetings and lobbying calls throughout the summer, and we spoke to legislators throughout Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. That was very important because oftentimes politicians aren't always fully aware of, or shouldn't say that. It's not at like the top of their list as far as like the environment and climate, and it should be. Along with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better agenda, we're trying to advocate for the regional greenhouse gas initiative to be included in Pennsylvania, or for Pennsylvania to be included in RGGI. That's something that, as far as what I can do, making those calls to politicians and legislators, the people that have the power to make that happen. And then this year we've also come across some legislation and bills that were against the environment. One that comes to mind specifically is Senate Bill 119. That's an anti-regional greenhouse gas initiative bill. And the whole point of the greenhouse gas initiative is to kind of monitor and control, put a cap on greenhouse gases, which are polluting our air and environment. There's also just the importance of clean jobs. So I've been trying to advocate and promote for that. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, is that, yes? Okay, sorry. Make sure I said it correctly. I actually just attended a meeting with Senator Bob Casey on CCC. He's trying to reintroduce that into the state. And that is going to provide education, training, and clean jobs to the state. So honestly, I'm really just trying to, for the most part right now, I've been advocating for clean energy and climate justice within those bills. There's a few that I'm leaving out, but if you Google Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, you can be included in our policy calls if you'd like to be involved in those. I just had a call. But that's some of the things that we have been doing. And more than ever now, we're trying to push local politicians to hear us and to do what they can as we're trying to pass this bipartisan bill and really making climate justice at the forefront of, what's going on in our world. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you for participating in the reign of God.
Full circle. Did you have one over there?
Hi, my name is Saroj Chhetri. I'm a student of physics as well as at Bahamas University. So my question is, scientists are continuously exploring the creation of the world, and there are such experiment, one of the experiment is Higgs boson experiment or God's particle experiment. So if that is proved, how we Christians view that and how it changes our theology? Thank you.
Not sure we have a whole lot of quantum physicists up here.
It's been a long time since I've had a physics class, I'll be honest. But I would say that, there's a couple different ways I can go with this. The first answer I would give is, I'm not sure it would, because in my experience with the church in general, science is not always the most trusted thing, which is unfortunate, particularly in areas that make Christians a little uncomfortable, like trying to talk about how the universe could have been formed without God, or without God doing every step of it, even if he'd created natural processes that could form it all. That starts to become a pretty uncomfortable place for some Christians. Other Christians are completely on board with it, and there's a big tension there. I think my concern for Christians would be, what if science could get to the point where we could explain, which I don't think we ever will, all of how life started, how the universe was formed, all of it. If we could explain every detail, would that remove God from the equation? I personally don't think so. And when science can explain things, it doesn't always give the full explanation either. One of the favorite examples that I used in my evolution creation course when I taught it here at Eastern was about, why is the water in the kettle boiling? Well, I can talk to you about the physics. I can talk about the heat, and the metal is warming up. The water particles are being heated. And as they are, there is steam coming out and the water is boiling. I could also talk about, it's boiling because I'm going to make a cup of tea, or it's boiling because my friend asked for a cup of tea. Those are three very different, maybe the second two are a little bit more similar, but different ways of explaining why the water is boiling. It doesn't make any of them wrong, but you don't get the full picture without all of them. And I think even if we can fully explain everything of how life came to be and the universe came to exist, I don't think we would still understand how those things started to begin with, and why we are so very, you can go with lucky or blessed, to have a planet that's the right distance from the right type of sun, with the right type of composition to form carbon-based life forms, with the right atmosphere, with the right amount of oxygen. There's just too many rights. This is beyond like even Goldilocks and the Three Bears like level of everything is perfect. And I kind of feel like there's some room there that I have to see where God's involved.
I've always liked Goldilocks. I agree entirely with what Becky has said. I would only add that there are a couple of questions that keep me coming back to God. Before I get to those questions, the wonderful discoveries of science about the universe and this planet have so far, at least, impressed me as enhancing my sense of the glory and wonder of God. And since the ancient churches, there has been an affirmation, a resounding affirmation of the mysteries of God that are beyond us. And so these new discoveries help remind me that I can't possess God, or even God's revelation, as Karl Barth would remind us, but must continually stand in awe. That said, there are those questions that I find impossible to grapple with, and I'll say on an existential level, without positing the existence of God. Now, the attributes of God are open for discussion in ways that God may limit God's self, et cetera, or not. But the why question is not a question that science directly addresses if that why pertains to meaning and purpose. The when, the why now, reminds us that we may have a vague sense of eternity, but not that we can grasp it. And if we refer to the universe, where is it positioned? You know, all of this points to the limitations of human intellectual ability and psychological ability as well. And so for me, on an existential level, as well as an intellectual level, positing a God helps me make more sense of it. And I'll just be honest, it preserves me from an intolerable degree of ontological shock.
Put that on a bumper sticker. Before I read our next question, can I address real quick that you mentioned the Higgs boson particle, which was colloquially called the God particle. The physicists involved in the discovery and the proving of that hated that name. That was something that the media came up with because it, as a discovery, was supposed to be impossible to see, right? Just like God, and you'll never find it, you'll never prove it. And it was theorized a long, long time ago, and it was through just a couple of years ago in the Large Hadron Collider. It seemed to show that yes, this is actually the Higgs field was somewhat proven, and this is how some of the mass in the universe is created. And so what we've learned through that and through the ways that the fundamental particles interact with each other is that the majority of the mass in the universe comes from the relationship between subatomic particles, not from them themselves. That the stuff that makes stuffness comes from relationship between things and not necessarily intrinsic to the things themselves. And if there's ever a bit of physics that'll preach, that'll preach. Actually, I have preached that before. So there are ways that the new discoveries in physics that may blow our minds also may be excellent examples of deep down truths that we find in our own religious traditions as well. So we have another question. This one is directed to Dr. Brash from Elmo Familiarin, thank you. Very small. As what the student essayist indicated earlier, science has given her insights that now shape the way she interprets scriptures in ways that she couldn't in times past. And so with what we know about the finiteness of Earth's natural resources and of how we are destroying it through amoral exploitation, how should we read in the present time the provisions of the Sabbath and the year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25?
Excellent question.
And maybe for those at home and here who maybe are not biblical scholars, you could tell us a little bit about what Leviticus 25 says.
Put me on the spot there, Zach.
I didn't, it was Elmo.
Well, if we're talking about the year of Jubilee, we're talking about Sabbath, we're talking about times of rest, times of restoration, times of returning to the way things were in order to reconsider how we move forward, who we are now and how we move forward. And as people of faith, what God may have for us in the present and in the future, and how we may participate better in that. And here I'd like to tell a story. I went to Drew University, and we had a colloquium series similar to this symposium. And that was in the thick of the Cold War. And in the thick of the Cold War, a rabbi who was speaking to us at the time gave an excellent lecture on the need for a national and indeed a global Sabbath. What would be the impact if we just took a breather from production? I don't want to detail that because I know too little about science. I'm not the scientist at the table. But if we took a breather from what we can take a breather from and listen, I'll say, to one another and listen for God. And for those who are so inclined, including myself, listen as we talk together for God through the texts.
Anybody else want to touch it?
I don't think in the way our society functions that we will take much of a Sabbath, or a year of Jubilee. I can't even imagine. People get upset about, some companies will get upset about people taking off like a day from work, let alone a year. But I think about the smaller things we can do now that we have the ability to do. Like one of the obvious ones to me is the use of LED light bulbs. And while there may be some other problems associated with them, they use far less electricity and they also save you money. So they're good for the environment and good for a business's bottom line. So those are things that can be beneficial in multiple ways. But I also think about how today our restoration work requires a lot of active work as opposed to just taking a step back. I think of the advances that we have in devices that are cleaning the plastics out of the ocean and things where it's the human innovation that is driving the things that will bring restoration. And I wonder if we've kind of hit past a tipping point, perhaps, where the restorative work requires a lot more action than it does rest, unfortunately.
But might rest give us some additional perspective. Not that that could happen on a societal level.
Agreed.
Elmo would like to respond to you.
I know Elmo well. I'm not surprised. Thank you, Elmo.
Thanks, Don. That's Elmo. I think it is also worth mentioning that the pandemic lockdown, when human activity was withdrawn globally, we have witnessed massive healing and restoration in nature.
Very good. Yeah. Not enough.
No. And then there was a pendulum swift the other way when we tried to make up for all of that afterwards.
Thank you, Elmo.
Look, it got quiet all of a sudden.
Uh-oh.
I just wanted to make a comment to go back to the pastor's question about some of his congregants are saying, why worry about the environment since ultimately it's going to be destroyed in apocalyptic pictures. It's reminiscent of what the Thessalonians were saying, that Jesus is coming back really soon, so why do we have to work? So we're sitting around waiting. And Paul's response was, you don't work, you don't eat. And the idea is really pretty simple. You don't know when Jesus is coming back. So this is what I would say to your congregants is that, yes, according to Isaiah and Revelation, Daniel, that eventually we get a new heaven and a new earth, but you don't know when it's going to be. And so we need to be stewards because that's the command. We could go on for centuries more in this world before Jesus comes back. So we need to take care of it now and not assume, like the Thessalonians did, that Jesus is coming back Tuesday. So that's what I would say to them. Yeah, Becky, I mean, ultimately the earth is going to be consumed by the sun. The sun is the ultimate climate changer. And the earth's climate's been changing ever since God made the place. The climate scientists almost never talk about the sun because they're goofy. But ultimately, unless Jesus comes back and changes things, the sun is going to consume the earth. That's the end of it. But that's, 1 billion or 2 billion years from now. So I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But that would be my response to your congregants is we don't know when Jesus is coming back. Therefore, the mandate is take care of the environment, do whatever we can to take care of it because our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, et cetera, we want to leave them a better world, not a worse world.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I add to that?
Please.
I just was going to say, because I feel like I didn't mention climate justice at all, but just looking at like the ways our weather and seasons have changed. Like I'm only 24, but I even have seen like throughout my childhood and now as an adult how much our weather has been impacted and our climate has been impacted. We've seen, hottest temperatures on record, and that's been, in our lifetime. So I feel like that's also very important to mention. Actually, I didn't mention the floods and things. So all of these, like, disasters and things we're facing that we weren't facing before, and it wasn't as dire as it is now. And it's kind of, crazy to think it could get worse. So I feel like just being aware of what's going on around us now is very important. And just through even how the seasons are not the same, and how the temperatures are always changing. It's hot and cold. I just feel like that has a lot to do with it as well, and acknowledging why we're facing these hotter days and things is important as well. So.
I just want to make a comment. Thank you guys for coming and speaking to us in regards to what's going on in our country and our, especially pertaining to environmental change. And I think that we have to keep the world better than we found it. It's God's world. And I think that our job as Christians, as people who are trying to be activists for climate change and for trying to biologically and scientifically make sure the world is okay. Because we have COVID, we have all these viruses, we have all these species that are invading our society and stuff and all that. So yeah. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
Well, so there's often a lot of discussion in when we talk about climate change and environmental justice and all of that. There's often discussions of doom, of gloom, of charts and graphs that only go in one direction, and of very sad polar bears. And I think we've kind of found in the past 20 years of trying to do that it makes very little lasting change in people's lives. You can't scare people into making forever changes. Any pastor who has preached hell understands that you have to give them a positive vision of something for people to actually want to change their lives. And so I've seen the conversation in recent years starting to shift away from here's the awful thing that we're doing to here's the vision of something that could be better. And this is what we're fighting for instead of against. Re-enchanting the world, helping people to fall back in love with the natural world as it is. And so I wonder if you might take a few minutes and just talk about where you find hope, where you find resilience, where you are inspired in the midst of all this climate crisis.
I guess I'll go first. I would say first in the work of some Christians in this field. In particular, I think of the Evangelical Environmental Network and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. I think of individuals like the Reverend Ben Lowe and Reverend Kyle Maynard Shop, who I know personally, and the work that they're doing in these fields, but also scientists like Catherine Hayhoe. And then we're going to get to hear from Melanie Harris in a bit. The work that they're doing, I think, is important. And seeing that interplay between faith and science and activism is incredibly important and hopeful for me. I see some hope in the resiliency that is part of our ecosystems, in the way that some species are adapting to changes, that some things may not. And even this past week, we added 20-ish species to the extinct list for this, I think in the US. And that is something I am devastated by. But I also recognize that that's as well part of what happens when things change. Just in our own lives, there are parts of our lives that if things have changed, we've left behind, and other parts that have thrived. And we're seeing that happen in nature. The fact that there are things that have resilience brings me hope. I find hope in God, in Scripture. There's a lot of Scripture where they're talking about times that were pretty bleak, and yet God remained and he delivered his people. That doesn't mean I think God is going to step in and tomorrow climate change isn't going to be happening, everything's going to be perfect. I don't think he's going to do that for us. But I suppose he could. I find a lot of hope in the global community. And then I also am marveled by their resilience. I think of the small island nations that are threatened by sea level rise, that someday will lose their entire nation, their island, their home. And they're talking about where will their people go? And they're making plans to do that, because I think I would be so filled with despair, I wouldn't know how to take that step, but they are. And then I've also been really impressed by my students in the past, by when we talk about how do we change the world. I've been impressed by the work of our young adults in this country. They are really interested in changing things and seeing the interconnection between theology and policy and business and science. And they're interested in finding the way to make all of this work together. But I really have to find hope, because if I don't, I know enough of the science about this to be entirely overwhelmed and depressed by it. And I refuse to let that be the place where I stop. There has to be hope, because otherwise, why would I try to change it? And God has not given me the opportunity to sit there and go, all of this is really bad, and I'm just going to think about that. That's not the message I see in Scripture.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on a lot of pretty much everything you said, especially just having other like-minded people that care gives me hope. And honestly, I'm from New Jersey. So yeah. And I graduated from Temple University last year for political science and environmental studies. And my sophomore year at Temple is when I like to say I started this journey. And honestly, switched my major like 3 times, but when I first got to Philadelphia, I didn't realize the network. Like, I didn't know how many people were doing the work in climate justice, environmental justice. So I feel like I gained a lot of hope and just also just feeling like I could make a change. That definitely came from the people that I was introduced to in this network and in this state. I'm very thankful and honored to learn and continue to learn and grow from a lot of the advocates that I work with on a daily basis. And honestly, as a young person, I find hope, as you mentioned, in other young people that are being leaders and in the climate and environmental justice field. I'm not even gonna lie, when I first, like in high school, I didn't really feel like anyone like in my class was really interested in the environment. And I realized that I was kind of the only one that was I went to high school for math, engineering, and science. So we spent like a week or two on sustainability and environmental policy. And that was enough for me to say that's what I'm supposed to be doing. But I was the only person that really, said, I want to look more into this. What jobs are out there? Like, how can I make this a career? So meeting young people like myself that are passionate and fighting and making changes is really what is inspiring for me, but also gives me a lot of hope.
I think that for me, the starting point of theology is hope. When there's nothing left, we have been divested of everything in our arms, to nod toward Augustine. What do we have left? We have hope. If we have anything at all, if we're still alive, as Kierkegaard would point out, we still have hope, even if we're in despair. There's still hope there. And I will admit that in the last couple of years, despair has been dogging my steps for reasons that include climate change, disease, to state the obvious, political issues. And so I find I have to take that step in hope, going forward with empty arms and see what God will put in. See what God will show me that I can make, that will serve as the ground of hope. And in reading Melanie Harris's book and seeing her proposed alternate epistemology, I found my heart stirred. And the heart of it, it seems to me, is a willingness to recognize the importance of people's stories, every individual story. And the more we listen to people's stories, the more we realize the vital importance of, I'll use the technical word, intersectionality. One person's problems aren't in a vacuum, do not exist in a vacuum. And the more we learn the lesson of listening to each other's stories, the more we see how intersected our stories are, the more we'll look out for one another and for the world on which we depend, of which we are integral parts. I think the more, noting that, I have more hope. The more I practice that, my hope is restored and grows. But then there are newspapers. So it's definitely a discipline.
Well, thank you for the nod to Dr. Melanie Harris, who will be our keynote speaker in just a few minutes. Her work is filled with resilience and hope in ways that I think will surprise and empower all of us. I want to thank you all for your time, your expertise, your passion, not only here on this stage, but in all that you do the rest of the days of the year. I know all three of you are out there actively making the world a better place. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you and leave you with a quote that is one of those quotes that nobody knows where it came from. I like to say it's Wendell Berry because he did say it, but that the wise person is one who understands that the world is not inherited from their forebears, but borrowed from their grandchildren. And so thank you for being the sorts of people who understand that and are working towards making a better world for our grandchildren. So thank you so much for your time. And we will take just a 15-minute break.